Dear students, dear colleagues, dear guests from the city and the surrounding area, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to today's Ruperto Carola lecture series, Intangible Heritage, a Resource for the Future. With this event, Heidelberg University is honoring the 20th anniversary of the UNESCO Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. My name is Thomas Schmidt. I teach the subject Cultural Heritage and the Protection of Cultural Property at Heidelberg University. Today we have an international guest, the highly esteemed colleague Professor Kristin Kuutma, who is well known and appreciated in the scientific community working on this UNESCO Convention of 2003. And that's why I'm very glad that you, dear Kristin, have accepted our invitation. I would like to introduce briefly the speaker. Kristin Kuutma is Professor of Cultural Studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia, where she was also born. She studied first English language and literature at Tartu State University in Estonia and received a PhD from the University of Washington with a work on a Sami ethnography and a Seto epic, two collaborative representations in their historical context. In the geographical context of Scandinavia and the Baltic region, she conducted research on the topic of oral traditions and their written fixation, a topic that plays a central role also in the formation of the idea of intangible heritage and its safeguarding. After her PhD, she held various positions in academia, but also in cultural institutions in the US, in Estonia, and in the UK. From 2007 to 2010, she was a visiting professor at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, UK. Between 2006 and 2010, she represented Estonia within the UNESCO Intergovernmental Committee for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, the decision-making body of the 2003 Convention. And this was an essential basis for her to engage with the politics of intangible heritage at the UNESCO level. In the ethnographic tradition, this research was based initially also on the inside view of a responsible actor. She published extensively on these issues, but also, for example, on the ethnography of the Sami in Scandinavia and on cultural festivals. Her publications in cultural anthropology focus on disciplinary histories, knowledge production, representation, and critical heritage studies. In addition to a professorship of cultural studies, she holds an UNESCO chair for applied studies of intangible cultural heritage. Dear Christine, we are glad that you are here today at Heidelberg University and are looking forward to your lecture.
Thomas, thank you for your kind words, and I'm really happy to be here in this really historical aula, and it is a pleasure to give a lecture in a hall and at a university that has heritage all around it, both tangible and intangible. And I'm also very grateful for this invitation to be part of this lecture series. Finally, I would be looking forward to your questions. And I know quite a number of you sit at the back. I hope you can see the slides from such a distance, because the slides will also have some text on them. But hopefully it will work. Now, yes, I had thought about starting with introducing myself, who I am and what I'm doing, but Thomas has done the job for me. But what is important is really to stress this, that I address the issue of heritage from a critical perspective, both with an insider and outsider take on what does it mean to designate something as heritage when look at the communities whom it affects deeply, because when we are talking about heritage, it isn't about an organic object. It is about people's lives and affecting people's lives. But I have also been as interested in understanding how does the politics of heritage work out, how it is designed, debated on international level, but also on national level and local level. And this has been my research interest for the past 2 decades. So doing a participant observation, but being also an observational participant in what is happening in the heritage scene. And now, yes, my talk today is about intangible heritage politics and the unattainable goal to reduce inequalities. It is related to one of the recent chapters I wrote for a collection, particularly focusing on sustainable development goals of the United Nations Agenda 2030 in connection with intangible cultural heritage. Well, this work is not out yet, but I have taken the research that I did for that article to use as examples for the talk today. But actually, my most recent engagement has been writing a substantial grant application, particularly focusing on inequalities in the heritage scene and thinking about heritage diplomacy and heritage futures. Right. Now, the language and keywords are important in my talk, just explaining where do the ideas that I use come from. And the main keywords I will focus on are sustainable development ideals, inequalities of recognition. The aspect of recognition on different scales is important, and then resource command that is tied to ownership and rights. So the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm sure that you are familiar with them, but they are actually, from the perspective of heritage and from the perspective of the international organization like UNESCO, quite a challenge. So what this organization and my talk relate to is the management of heritage. The attainable goals, or the hope that the goals might be attainable, or they are at least an agenda for us, actually contains a call for shift in mindset and stance. And this is something that is not easily done by a global organization like UNESCO. So the other aspect is alignment of sustainability with preservation concerns when corresponding it to fundamentally retrospective safeguarding. When we talk about heritage, and it becomes particularly poignant from the perspective of intangible heritage, this retrospective approach seems to be paramount, but that actually celebrates the act of stasis when culture, by default, is dynamic and people's interaction is dynamic. And as I already mentioned, I'll tackle inequalities in this politics of recognition. My talk connects the ICH configuration, intangible cultural heritage, known very often and referred to with the acronym ICH, which I actually do not like very much, because this kind of compartmentalize and fixes things when you use an acronym, when you actually talk about something that is changing all the time. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. Well, the SDGs, the acronym for Sustainable Development Goals, require a closer look at the agenda to reduce inequalities, which is one of the main goals, which links to several other goals like empowering communities, gender equality, endorsing livelihoods, etc. In some, you actually can relate intangible heritage nearly to all the goals, or actually all of them, without partitioning them into separate approaches. Intangible cultural heritage is a political descriptor with modifying capacity. What I want to point out is the predicament with granting agency in the politics promoted by the ICH discourse. The dilemma of state control over the terms of recognition and relevant representational activities in the ICH framework sets the rules of the game in mediated representation, that is, standing and speaking for someone who is not or cannot be present or speak for themselves. Heritage legislation tends to authorize the dominant systems of ownership that reinforces power imbalances, particularly for indigenous descendant communities and minority groups. And these statements that I've made, I'll come back to them and dwell on them and unravel them later on. The ethnographic material I base these deliberations on is based on my long-term extensive fieldwork carried out during nearly 2 decades at targeted meetings focusing on the UNESCO ICH-related policies. These discussions and debates on implementation issues have rendered for me various opportunities to obtain insights on local, national, and international level, which means that I have attended meetings on these 3 different scales. And also, I have attended these meetings in several geographic locations. Meetings as organizational device offer fieldwork sites for relating and providing access to communicative forms of epistemic and social contexts. By participating in assorted gatherings, I have acquired instructive anthropological knowledge and data on the organizational format, as well as various aspects of policymaking. The ethnographic observations made derive from a multi-site experience when following people, ideas, and policy configurations in diverse settings to do the reflection on what is happening on different scales. Now I come to conceptual conundrums. My analysis starts with this semantics, yet conceptual reflections that bring forth veiled assumptions and subtle constraints, because how we talk about things not only defines but also constructs them. Sustainability as a concept poses a semantic conundrum. It is by nature amorphous and fluid, which, for example, may elucidate by querying whether it is a restrictive or generative construct. Contending that no concept can capture the complexity of actual social processes, I'll highlight first the intention to set limits. When we are talking about sustainability, reflections derive from the agenda of imposing limitations with a goal of restricting overexploitation of resources, be those social, economic, or environmental, the pillar areas of sustainability that uphold the responsible goal-setting guidelines. At the same time, addressing economic or environmental concerns in SDGs bring forth the experience of cultural considerations because they are socially embedded in a profound manner. However, suffice to reiterate the explosion of the term sustainability in the sphere of culture, the field of heritage studies included, where it invokes complex ethical considerations set in shifting sites of empowerment and vulnerability. Conversely, the compound sustainable development implies the notion of change and resorts to the connotation of prospering by possible amplification. Thus emerge inherent contradictions with a component of development when contemplated the implication to growth. The paradox of economic growth suggests expansion potentially detrimental to living conditions and survival, having brought about the new concept from environmental activism via the field of ecological economy, degrowth. The objectification of development or cultivating a linear progress has induced marked anthropological criticism when encounters between development policy and practice and its beneficiaries reveal unintended consequences, or in turn, affordances. Similarly, the more recent investigative studies of the role of culture in the age of sustainable development propose not to regard development as progress, but rather a complex process played out in local contexts. What poses serious problems is the semantic inflation around the concepts of culture and sustainable development, turning them into floating signifiers that cannot be genuinely employed in cultural policymaking. Another conceptual constraint calls to reconsider the place of culture in sustainable development when giving a more nuanced reflection to the claim that culture plays a driver for sustainable development. It has also been pointed out that culture imbued to the mainstream development discourse rather recently, although leading to the reconceptualization of the culture development nexus. On the other hand, the anthropological discourse vehemently cautions against essentializing culture or perceiving it as a monolithic, clearly delineable whole or congruent with a population group. Such misconception remains still pertinent in the context of preservationist agendas, and therefore abstaining from articulating it on the instrumental first page would make sense for the Sustainable Development Goals, as the situation is today. Nonetheless, the analytical disciplinary standpoint underscores the aspect of diversity and pluralism that punctuates human experience on the ground in a locally meaningful way. Well, I will now turn to living heritage. And here also previously I have really substantially utilized the thinking of colleagues like Sofia Labadi, William Logan, Lynn Meskel, Weber Ndoro, Susan K. Tumetse, who have written on those issues before me. So living heritage is embodied in people, and safeguarding is a practice that depends on the interconnectedness of knowledge systems, issues of ownership, of self-determination. In the assemblage of intersecting concepts and practices become cogent yet another moment of affordance or a license to change, that of resilience. It relates ideationally to the management of resources, but one may draw here a contour also to the claim for agency. Resilience invokes the ability to recover from adversity or deformation, making conceptually an analogy with the ability of an ecosystem to return to its original state after being disturbed. However, in the domain of intangible cultural heritage, already such designation as intangible heritage signals by default a change, a novel situation, a transformation. In the discourse endorsed by the Global Managerial Unit, the UNESCO Living Heritage Entity, as it is called today, it has been gradually been a work towards replacing the intangible cultural heritage with the signifier living heritage. This noteworthy deictic shift implies a tacit conceptual development that does not automatically transpose to the policy level. The representative infrastructure depends on an inert retrospective appraisal of cultural expressions which are transformed into highly politicized commodity signified as heritage. The national governance infrastructure works for representational celebratory inscription in designated lists and congruent static conservational purposes. Also, that state-monitored infrastructure is constantly opposing the inherent integrity and interconnectedness of SDGs that fundamentally do not subject to selective parceling, if the transformational agenda is taken seriously. The UNESCO Ice Age configuration and managerial regime substantiates cultural politics manifestly and functions through policy making. Therefore, we should acknowledge the existential confrontational rift identified. The inability from the perspective of cultural policy to embody the multitude of incompatible roles in relation to sustainable development. My discussion today concerns the reduction of inequalities, as I mentioned, and the issues related to economic growth, highlighting in this context the more responsible consumption and production. The following highlights the issues of inclusive recognition and redistribution of agency, and affordance, defined as entitlements to capabilities. And this is a definition used by philosopher Martha Nussbaum. My ideational analysis looks at the ability to engage with the social structure in question, to discern veiled inequality or contested positionality, to contemplate what kind of resource is found in representation. Inequality refers to social disparity with unjust distribution of resources and opportunity. While the ICH regulatory system unavoidably propounds inequitable representation and competing claims for resource command, in indigenous as well as minority group rights framework persist claims for instrumental acknowledgement. Now I will talk about converting structural agency. A reflection on the culturalized politics concerning heritage to unravel the mechanisms of governmentality and the concurrent rights-based discourses will be here in the focus. One should make a distinction between the spheres of lived experience and the designated UNESCO ICH domain with its redistribution of political and socio-economic power, with a structuring normativity that go against the nature of cultural dynamics, mobility, and license to change. For the community, ICH is a dynamic resource, but from the state perspective, the image of ICH is stagnant by default. Nevertheless, the prevalent actor in the UNESCO ICH configuration is the nation state. That is, the self-governing political entity whose administrative management also defines the heritage discourse on its territory, its epistemic and ontological parameters. Those discursive factors generate a site of contested identity and rights, which reflects the domestic and global politics of recognition, where cultural heritage is employed for orchestrating differences, to use the term by Waldemar Hafstein, within the state and between states. The global UNESCO organization functions via governmental mediation that is substantially dependent on state-monitored activities and the prevalent political system where the quality of accountability of policy implementation as well as inclusive principles of management define it. Heritage regimes are crafted within and by a particular state apparatus. And here I've used my colleagues Regina Bendix and Birgit Müller for putting together this argumentation. A closer examination of the infrastructure at play reveals that the UNESCO governance of culture operates through the structural change and strategic transformation on the ground when targeted policy setting when targeted policy setting activities produce ultimately novel organizational configurations. So this is one of the major points I've made before, that the organizational configuration changes by default, which means nothing can be the same as it was before heritage designation. What's more, the 2003 Convention operational directives have set for it a strategic obligation, particularly through the inventory making and community representation requirement, while this objective on national level compels a particular organizational format as a procedural corollary on local level. However, a UNESCO nomination does not drop into an empty space, but tops an already existing format of management and representation on the ground, although on a different scale and authority. The community must reinvent itself as a heritage stakeholder to comply with the UNESCO regulations and execute a certain normative turn that also shifts ownership configurations. The basically novel organizational structure is a prerequisite for the administrative logic of the convention and its listing mechanism. Hence, the local situation is changed by default. The process is usually parallel to conceptual debates on what is meant by intangible cultural heritage, as opposed to previously used terms referring to popular traditions, folk culture, or folklore, depending on regional or language contexts. The stance for normative authority of ICH governance and modern management techniques refashions the grassroots frame of reference and authorities that effects remedial change in agency and the system of ownership. And now, as you can already see on the slide, I will bring examples from Estonia, but also refer to our neighboring Latvia. The Estonia ratified the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2006, as did actually several Eastern European countries that were finding their new identity as a nation after the communist rule. For example, in Estonia, so now I'm going back to the management issues, the Ministry of Culture set up a board of intangible cultural heritage that comprised stakeholders from researchers, cultural animators, regional and local NGOs, to councillors from the ministerial and local UNESCO offices who debated and redefined the conceptual sphere. So from the beginning, it was a democratic exercise trying to get as many people involved and interested on board. In addition, during the process of drafting the UNESCO nomination candidature file, the involved Seto community assembled a special NGO in 2008, Leelo Tarku Kogo, Council of Master Leelo Singers, composed of representatives of Leelo choirs, which Leelo choirs are choral groups of roughly 5 to 10 singers, identified as the main stakeholders. Though prior networking may have occasionally occurred, such an organization of choir representatives did not previously exist. Among other things, they have regularly convened seminar meetings for debating the state of their practice. And what now is more important, and that is also a background to my showing the map and where the communities are, is that now these designated communities have started communicating between each other. The Seto community nomination, the Leelo tradition nomination, actually did come as an initiative from the community, because there was another community who was recognized by the Masterpieces program that was promoting the UNESCO 2003 convention already several years earlier, and the Seto community became, or the community leaders became inspired by it. And actually, to date, in Estonia, the inscription on the UNESCO list has to come or be initiated by the community. So the Ministry of Culture doesn't have a say in it, even if they want to, as they actually initially did. The UNESCO-related programs initiate new organizational structures which, from the perspective of the community, may be complementary, but also competitive and antagonistic. There are different kinds of expertise and interests discernible on community level, depending on the personal practical engagement or position in community leadership. And now I'll show again the map, because I'm getting to the next community, the Kihnu Island, that is on the western coast. So the map hopefully gives you some idea that they are rather distant geography-wise. Right, as it happened in the Kihnu Island, with only 700 registered inhabitants, but renowned as the representative list inscribed cultural space in Estonia, 2 competitive organizations were set up in connection with the listing, while a third one emerged quite recently. Still, these new organizations may stimulate unprecedented community-based initiatives and cooperations. Right, and here is a slide introducing the Kihnu cultural space, and that is why I've used now more images of the landscape, because as a cultural space, the whole island is, so to say, inscribed with everything included, leaving nothing out from that seminal inscription. Right. And now kind of telling you about why there is on the map that I have used, there is also a Latvian community. The Seto community is organizing today joint ventures with the geographically remote Kihnu Islanders, as well as actively collaborate with the Suiti in neighboring Latvia, inscribed on the urgent safeguarding list. Thus, such UNESCO designations enhance innovative joint ventures and communication between previously distant communities who didn't have any contact with each other whatsoever. Cultural specialists, as well as researchers, need to reinvent, reconsider, and transform terminology alongside with apparent changes in the organizational formation, as I already mentioned, which incite further interpretation. And any reference to heritage suggests proprietor relations. The alteration in heritage authorities may shepherd into existence new political entities, albeit within a national framework. The Ice Age safeguarding configuration by UNESCO instigates a transformation and restructuring with an emergent organizational structure which does not necessarily correspond to or rely on the previously functioning system, which has been the case with all the 3 that I've mentioned, with the Seto community, the Kihnu community, and also the Suiti. Hence, some hierarchies in expertise and policy-setting institutions become altered under the aegis of the Ice Age conceptualization. In some, the Ice Age format generates a new policy of cultural management that brings about conceptual and social change. Consequently, it can be stated that we are dealing here with the process of cultural change that depends on interaction knowledge transfer, and shifts in agency. And now I'll turn to economic affordances when thinking about license to change. When addressing the realm of cultural heritage, the omnipresent social struggles around ownership and control of provenance and possession take the front stage. Although cultural governance stakeholders, particularly on national level, often feel discomfort with and articulate an organizational problem with economic activities, by highlighting the menace of over-commercialization, it may at the same time demonstrate a conflict with local community interests. The issues of ownership and resilience concern crucially the option of asserting rights vis-à-vis state authorities and sustaining local livelihoods while negotiating new economic opportunities for the community. In Estonia, the Kihnu community is facing additional existential problems in connection with the pressing renewable energy objectives. As I showed you, yes, this being an island community, of course there is an interest to build wind farms around the island. European Green Deal challenges and currently rising electricity costs have expedited the national plans for constructing offshore wind farms, where one of the targeted sites would be the seabed in the vicinity of the Kihnu island. The islanders try to make themselves heard in the debates with local municipality and government officials on how the planned turbines would affect their environment as they know it. There have emerged also initiatives to seek guidance from UNESCO-related programs, as a result of which I was interviewed in an expert capacity by the National Broadcasting Agency on whether inscription on the representative list could endorse arguments for challenging corporate, governmental, and business operators. The Kihnu community seeks to find consensus in assessing the imminent retributions. They have voiced their possible interest in crafting new job opportunities, for instance, as turbine guardians, catering also to tourists, and not simply monetary retribution that was initially on the table. On the other hand, they fear the environmental effects on the fish population, as fishing was traditionally one of the major sources of livelihood, rendered accordingly in the intangible heritage safeguarding and management plans drawn already 2 decades ago. Even though the number of professional fishermen has reduced drastically due to the decline of fish stock in the Baltic Sea. But at the same time, when tourism has become one of the major subsistence revenues, the islanders dread its possible consequences, like, for example, the aggravatingly disturbing seabird shooting tours. The local economic resources is often the realm of local economic resources is often controversial. However, economic is social by default, and thus economic issues depend on, are embedded in, as well as reflect social relations. The representation of culture and its contextualization in history plays an instrumental role in the economic aspects of tourism, of branding, of marketing. Tourism is the modern global practice that brings revenue far and wide, and ideally to the stakeholder communities. The promotion of a particular product or cultural entity entails advertising of distinctive features, while marketing encompasses the whole process of researching, promoting, selling, and distributing the potential to the potential consumers. This aggregator functions is deemed to operate in the sphere of intangible cultural heritage today when attracting the new generation or targeting potential visitors. With the Seto community in Estonia, the traditional singing practices, engaging mostly women, are today also substantially related to tourism. There has emerged a novel space of practice, that of organized short-term recreation camps for Lelo singing instruction, which appears to be concurrently a source of income for the women running such camps. This is another example how the traditional practice may retain in a new form. Intensive few days away from daily routines engages those interested in learning the artistic skills, both by locals and outsiders, that simultaneously provide innovative means for collective practice in the modern individualistic daily life. On the other hand, when tourism becomes the most available source of income, changes occur also in the communities of practice. For example, one of the prominent Seto community activists who has been a Lelo singing teacher to the young for decades is today committed to running the village center that includes a restaurant with local dishes on the menu. In August 2021, she excused her absence from the discussion meetings related to Lelo singing by being occupied with the catering for this event and for tourists. The summer period was for her the time to earn an income that would sustain her family through winter. The above demonstrates how the communities singled out by the UNESCO listing mechanism in Estonia struggle to deal with the moral commitment to maintaining heritage practices and relevant livelihoods, regardless of the substantial transformations. There is one other aspect that I'm not going to dwell on because of time constraints. This is gender. So as you have already probably noticed, that these are particularly women who are retaining those traditions deemed heritage, and the women are most active in it, although both men and women do use the new livelihood opportunities, and their livelihood does and income depend on that, particularly from the point of view of tourist management. Community members try to create new economic opportunities related to traditional practices to find ways for experience exchange and to establish partnerships through heritage-related networks, which draws added attention to the license to change. The economic potential related to intangible cultural heritage bears on the aspect of turnover, on employment, and on meaning with a specific role of knowledge and reputation. Even if expressive practices seemingly pertain to another category with contrasting ethos, the previous or historical means of subsistence, often related to crafts, cannot occur outside the prevalent revenue relations. ICH rebranding, the branding effect of intangible cultural heritage, has been found greatly instrumental. It helps the farmers and crafters to raise their personal and their product profiles. It elevates the status of cultural practices. Consequently, it appears that international recognition facilitates negotiations for better conditions perhaps first and foremost in relation to governmental ordinance. The commercial dimension of local food and crafts is quite explicit, and all things considered, consumption is in essence a form of social participation. With that in mind, argumentation on whether the market is a safeguarding measure or does it premise sustainability may take some additional coloring when thinking about sustaining local livelihoods or creating new economic opportunities related to traditional practice. When ICH is claimed to have made practitioners more resilient to market logic, one should acknowledge its concurrent evidence of imminent change. Yes. And now turning to the aspect of change and agency again, yet intangible heritage engaged cultural workers appear holding often a strongly felt moral principle and demonstrate discomfort towards possible commercial initiatives or practices as an unappealing ramification. But from a broader and complex social perspective, an alternative outlook to the affordability and upscaling of economic activities may eventually concur better with the ideals pronounced in the SDGs. Particularizations of conceptual and economic issues outline the paramount and yet wicked problem of the moral effect of the intangible cultural heritage designation and the instrumentality of resources. The power and the politics of representation and resources at risk due to economic or social transformations exposit concerns related to cultural and social rights. And now I turn to inequality, limits of representation, and change in positionality. My last point. Another aspect of representational agency appears with contested claims of possession or ownership. The ICH framework instigates sentiments and policies of protectionism, nativism, and nationalism, but controversially, intangible cultural heritage may be implemented as a strategy in resistance to stately regulations or centralized authoritarian policy. It is likewise significant to point out instances when the state-monitored UNESCO recognition has been modest or even failed in granting respectable community agency on organizational level. Particularly indigenous, but also local communities have manifested reservations in respect to state mediations. Moments of social articulations when local heritage actors bring their own cultural resources to bear simultaneously expose the limits of governmentality as well as enlarge rights-based discourse and practice in fields of heritage politics. And here I rely on the Canadian legal scholar Rosemary Kuutma. The communities and groups may appear searching for agency in this configuration and eventually generate a change in positionality. For example, in Estonia, the inclusion of ethnic minority groups in the national imaginary of intangible heritage has been selective and dependent on the historical status of such groups, which also involves their position in academic research. This imaginary consequently chooses to overlook the migratory groups from the Soviet period while picking out those with roots in a more distant past, like the Russian Orthodox Old Believers in eastern Estonia, whose ancestors migrated to these lands after refusing the mid-17th century Russian church reforms presenting today a staple Slavic minority in the national imaginary, defined by religious and agricultural practices, language, and seclusion. Significantly, their traditions uphold isolation and a historic distrust towards the government, which may have played a part in the community leaders' decision to turn down the offer for the government-sponsored UNESCO-related recognition, a position that their community gets direct access to governmental financial support through other channels was voiced unyieldingly at a consultation meeting gathered by the Estonian National Commission for UNESCO that I attended in 2005. This stance seems to continue, demonstrated by their absence on the national ICH database that evolves based on voluntary submissions. And now I'm turning to the Sami in Scandinavia. Indigenous or descendant communities appear to be in a particularly complicated and vulnerable position in the parameters of the worldwide ICH legislation. The state-defined, monitored, and represented agency contravenes with the principles of autonomous knowledge systems, of self-determination and ownership rights, when the degree of state control delineate and regulate issues with the politics of recognition, of possession, and access to resources. Even if experts have voiced their concern long ago, according to my observations at the intergovernmental ICH-related meetings, many administrative functionaries have remained reluctant to discuss inclusive measures for indigenous and minority groups in the UNESCO ICH policymaking framework that would call for action on the national level. More substantial moves in that direction have been taken only recently, when the UNESCO Living Heritage entity negotiated for targeted opportunities with the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which demonstrates an effort to seek partnership to further a common cause. But the participatory parity does not extend the whole way in the UNESCO-related intangible heritage discourse and representation of indigenous rights. Achieving political recognition from their native countries continues to be one of the most contentious struggles for indigenous peoples. There should occur a shift towards autonomous representational agency when interconnectedness of ICH knowledge systems and intellectual property become grounded as a right for cultural autonomy and self-determination. Within international organizational attachments and in the configurations of normative instruments, the political ecology of the cultural heritage rights is now tied to membership in specific communities rather than national citizenship. Now, kind of wrapping up with the Sami issues, I must reiterate that the most instrumental in Sami politics has been the concept of indigeneity as it is defined in the International Labour Organization. And in their promotion of self-government, the Sami Parliament documentation declares the paramount position of their own terms in handling intangible heritage references. Noteworthily, a certain shift has occurred since 2008 with Sami representatives attending Intergovernmental Committee meetings of the 2003 convention as part of the Norwegian delegation, and with a couple of targeted promotional conferences and seminars taking place recently, with effectual input from the designated heritage agencies in Finland and Norway. Hosted by these events were hosted by the Sami Parliament and the Arts and Council of Norway. Ultimately, a productive visionary approach to the issue of group rights for indigenous peoples acknowledges the endemic form of accountability that restricts the larger society of its sovereignty, as has been pointed out by Will Kumlika. These instances draw attention to the power and disputed politics of representation, where the historical experience defines imaginaries in the present, and it molds also is molded by the current dynamics and positionalities, or constrains the retribution of agency. Self-representational agency and the consecutive resource command research commands imply the empowering recognition of and practical implementation of cultural and social rights also in the ICH framework that is dependent on the state-monitored system. And I now come to the conclusion. This talk was on ownership and rights for recognized resource command, but I will return to the observations that Yudhishthir Vajizar made when analyzing sustainable development from the perspective of cultural policymaking. The major cultural challenge would be to engage with the ecological on the local level. That, in turn, requires enhanced parity by acknowledging grassroots agency in ecosystem management, exploring the potentials and possibilities in heritage-focused practices and livelihoods to generate sustainable existential measures, the empowerment through endorsed social-cultural change. This is a call for a new political economy that enhances local solutions, or in other words, small-scale interventions that respond to global challenges. And kind of the politics of recognition of rights and affordances generates access to networks, infrastructures, knowledge, or institutional recognition of self-representation. For indigenous and minority groups, that would require a change in positionality in heritage governance. Agency in resource command denotes participatory parity that translates also to social resilience, where heritage is not treated as a marketable commodity, but as a vehicle for finding strength through embracing change. And thank you for your attention.